Добрий день, колеги.
Good morning, dear colleagues. I'm happy to see you all in those challenging times for our country and for us in particular. Regardless the military aggression of Russia against Ukraine, we keep working, we are working effectively. We have more work added on to our daily routine, daily schedule. It happens so in the world of journalism because we are trying to cover the news in hot spots. Some people across the globe say that this is hot spot. For me, it's a war. It's not a hot spot. Our online discussion is about freedom of media during Russia's aggression against Ukraine. If we compare this war with other wars where our compatriots were participating, this war seems like a paradox, like oxymoron. What kind of freedom of speech are we going to talk about during the war? But the martial law means that the government has total control of media, and this is justifiable because most of us accept this. On the other hand, we see that situation is somewhat different in Ukraine. We cannot say that we are all speaking in unison. There are some media who are already getting away from this matrix, just reporting the facts. They also offer their reviews, their analytics, their critics. Some of them have offered it since day one of the war. There also has been some negativity. We all remember the 3 channels that were excluded from the digital broadcasting. And the third problem we'd like to focus on, this is perception or misperception by our colleagues and by us that we are broadcasting in single news and freedom, and there are journalists who are taking part in this project, journalists who were working in Medvedchuk's channel, Inter channel, and they were propagating Russian peace, Kremlin propaganda. And of course, that begged a lot of questions. Some people suggest that maybe they repented, maybe they understood that they were in the wrong and they have been sincere in doing what they are doing in serving the people of Ukraine. But we see that the war posed new challenges. And I'd like to welcome Vitaly Portnykov. And my question for Vitaly is the following. Is war consistent with the freedom of world, or freedom of speech, or freedom of speech is non-existent during the war? Of course, it is consistent. And in democratic statehood, no conditions can cancel the freedom of speech. We don't understand what restrictions we have during the martial laws, but I've been talking about that since 2014, since Russian troops invaded Ukraine. And since then, we've been fighting this war. Some compatriots of ours have ended this war already in their mind, but we have to understand if Vladimir Putin remains the president of Ukraine, so no truce would mean that the war is over, even if it is over in the minds of many of our compatriots. But we are sober people, we are sensible people, we understand that we will have to live in these conditions up until Ukraine joins NATO. So this is only the first war. There might be other phases of this war, more hostile phases. And this is the reality that we will have to live through for most of our lives. Yesterday, we see this Ukrainian Defense Consultative Group meeting in Ramstein Air Base, and I believe that Ukraine will probably join NATO soon. But since 2014, we have to have military censorship, something we don't have up until today. This censorship means that there should be limitations on disclosure of information that might be sensitive to our safety and security. In Israel, even the names of people who died in terroristic attacks are disclosed only after this military censorship. Only after that, they can make this information public. I'm not even talking about the activities during the escalation of the conflict, the way it was during the war in Israel against the Arab countries, or the situation with the autonomy of Palestine in the western part of Jordan River in Gaza sector. There are clear restrictions when it comes to disclosure of information, especially the one that is owned by law enforcement and defense agencies, period. The actions of political leadership of the country are being discussed. Internet, TV channels, in their assessment of the activities of the political leadership of Ukraine, have all the freedom, but we are not talking here about the army, and we are not talking about the supreme commander. This information is not for disclosure because it can harm the army and it can harm the country. But after every war in Israel, the Commission convenes, which involves the representatives of parliament, experts, military experts, and they discuss all decisions of the political leadership of the country before and after the war. If we do not convene such commission, and if we do not discuss the actions of political and military command of our country of 2021, 2022, or maybe even previous leadership, but it's more important to discuss the activities of the current leadership, then we can lose the situation. We have to talk about success and losses. We have to discuss the decisions made, but this can only be done after the active hostilities phase is over. The government has also live according to effective laws of Ukraine. When we are talking about exclusion of 3 TV channels from the single news marathon, these 3 media, they are not in one group with the oligarch channels that have united in one group. So it has not been done on the level of regulating authorities. There was the decree of the National Council of Security and Defense, and all media had to participate in this marathon. Unfortunately, Прямий, the Fifth Channel, and Espresso have been excluded from the digital broadcasting. And that was following the decision of the civil servant in the Agency of Radio and Television. He never explained why he made this decision, and it's not related to the freedom of speech. I believe that such actions should be criminally liable, and also the actions of those civil servants who do not want to take the responsibility for such decisions.
We should be discussing it with them. We don't have any decision of the National Security and Defense councils that we can challenge, and they have to decide how channels participate in this TV channel, but that's what we don't have. There is no decision that we can challenge or we can present, and it is not the reason, just if we have got the martial law, it is not a pretext to violate legislation, and not a single political motive can change the situation. This easy and simple fact. So we are not now discussing, in the case of the Fifth Channel, Primary Channel and Espresso, the freedom of expression. So it is not about the freedom of expression. It's about abuse of the current legislation. And when we are trying to discuss the situation as it is after the war, we don't know what the situation is going to be after the war, who will be leading the state after the war, because the events are just starting to evolve, and they may achieve their critical tipping point at a later stage. We are at the very beginning of very dire ordeal for the Ukrainian state. And after the war, no matter what it ends in, we will see a state with a ruined economy, without the market of advertising, and it will be rebuilt only, say, in 7 years after the end of the war. And under these circumstances, there might be no audience to consume Ukrainian language media products. So we are at the beginning of a disaster, the scale of which we cannot fathom right now. And the task of the Ukrainian state now is to win in this war, to survive and to preserve the achievements that made it possible for us to be strong, to have a strong army, to have democracy, to be prepared for European and Euro-Atlantic integration. That's what makes us a non-aggressive country. Now I would like to give the floor to Ihor Rozkladai, who is a lawyer. Ihor, Vitaly has expressed his visionary understanding of how the media could survive in the period of the war. And we see the realities of today, and we can say that indeed we do have this freedom of expression even during the war. At the same time, if you respond to what Vitaly has said and about the decisions of powers that be, even though nobody shouldered the responsibility for this ousting of 3 channels from the digital broadcast. Is this approach well justified? So Vitaly Portnykov's intervention says that we do have the freedom of expression, and I do agree with Vitaly in that the situation with the war is a sad one, because you have anticipated the risks, and now those risks have come true. And we can see it not only in the media sphere, may also see that in our decommunization effort, when we were demanding for certain museums to be removed, and now we've lost the KGB archive in Chernihiv. We lost certain very important historic documents in Mariupol, and that's just a minute part of our losses. And as I said, I do agree with Vitaly in that it's the right time for us to start discussing these issues. I want to be positive and to apply positive thinking, and I do hope that this would be the last war for the Russian Federation as it is now, and we have to reevaluate our rules and regulations and our approaches to how the market is regulated and how the freedom of expression survives in our country. Now we've got the law on television and radio broadcasting, which is obsolete, morally obsolete, I would say, and unfortunately we haven't had an opportunity to promote and have adopted the new law. And now we see that certain limitations or restrictions can be imposed in accordance with the law. And those are just very broad framework norms which tell us how the state should operate under the conditions of an armed attack. But we see that the decisions adopted since the 24th of February have been ad hoc, had been haphazard. As a result, several channels have been ousted from the digital broadcast, and the same pertained to Souspilnist, for example, when they were banned in one city because the mayor said that he didn't want journalists in his city. And we understand that these issues have not been regulated properly by the effective legislation. And we have to spot all of such gaps in legislation so that at a later stage they can be addressed. And Ukraine hasn't been at war over the years of its independence, unlike Russia, with two Chechen wars, with the war against Georgia, with the Syrian war, etc. So Russia is a trigger-happy country. Ukraine is not like Russia, and it characterizes us as a state. On the other hand, it is a drawback because we are not prepared for the this regime of martial law, even at the level of legislation. And when the presidential decree was issued on the 24th of February, we saw that there are certain gaps in regulation. On the other hand, the very fact that we have got this freedom of expression, the volunteer movement can be operating, we still can document war crimes committed by the Russian military. And I think that globally and conceptually, the preservation of the freedom of expression during the war enabled us to survive during this war. If we look back at the Second World War, we understand that it was a totally different context, and the battle between two totalitarian regimes, the Nazi one and the Soviet ones, the first thing they did was take away all of the radio receivers so that the populations in both countries didn't know what was going on. For example, my grandfather had a radio receiver and he could, in a clandestine manner, listen to some of the radio channels. But when there is no access to information, it gives very good soil for disinformation. And I do agree with Vitaly in what he said about the military censorship. Of course, this story in Odessa with this foreign journalist, with the incoming fire, with posting footage of military deployments and facilities. So that deprives us of the opportunity to put up very effective defense against the aggressor. And of course, the purpose of this censorship should be to protect human lives and our defenses. And of course, we have to analyze all of the existing best practices, including Israeli experience, and see how it applies and how it can be planted on our soil. It should be adjusted to our context, of course, but I do like this idea because it enables us to preserve freedom and opportunity for public discussion on the one hand, while censorship being applied to some pointed things. And at the same time, it preserves the freedom of expression. Another thing that merits noting is that strong censorship during this war might be justified when it comes to humanitarian facilities. Let us be frank, the majority of what has been built in Ukraine was built in the Soviet times. And the documentation about some of those facilities is now in the possession of the enemy. And the majority of their targets, military targets, are not military installations. Remember when they destroyed a residential house in Kiev? Earlier, it was the location of a military base. So now we have to apply the common sense rules, and even if what happened with one of the TV channels when they provided a story of one of the military installations, and then it was targeted by the enemy. And even though that channel had a permit to take their footage there, it should be checked and rechecked, vetted and re-vetted several times. And the journalists should ask themselves, what is the purpose of my publishing this story on my channel eventually? So in any case, we have to revise our legislation, return to the idea of certain regulations to be put in place with regard to online media. I understand that Ukraine might not be capable of addressing these issues on its own. And if we've got this certain financial obligations to a company based in Dubai, I always ask a question, who would be paying for that? And that's the thing that we have to scrutinize and address at the international level. On the one hand, it is more convenient to broadcast information while you are based abroad. On the other hand, we understand that it could be a source of propaganda, and we remember examples of our colleagues being killed in the temporarily occupied territories, and all of the channels that had huge impact on the domestic policies. I will stop here because we've got a lot of other colleagues to join in this discussion. Thank you. Now, speaking about Telegram and other online media outlets, and I think Halyna will comment on that at a later stage, but I will now give the floor to Oksana Romaniuk, and she will tell us about the security and safety of journalists. Now we have discussed the issues of censorship during the war, and we understand that information about the military should be properly protected. But what about the safety and security of journalists themselves? Are we successful in guaranteeing that? What is in the way of proper protection and defense of the journalists, and who is responsible for so many deaths of the journalists? Oksana? Speaking about responsibility, it's Russia that is responsible. Over the 2 months of this all-out war against Ukraine, we've registered 243 crimes committed by the Russian military against Ukrainian journalists and Ukrainian media. It's a huge number, and the situation as it is much worse than in Syria, for example. 7 journalists were killed in action.
14 colleagues died during the shelling. So they were either in armed forces or in territorial defense units. 14 journalists, at least 14, are missing. We don't know whether they are alive and when they were missing. We are trying to follow all those cases. We are trying to check in on them. Unfortunately, we don't know what happened to Dmytro Halynyuk, Union correspondent. He was abducted by the Russians in Kyiv region. As far as we know, he admitted that he was a journalist at the time when he was abducted. And unfortunately, we haven't heard from him ever since. Kyiv region was liberated. His name is being repeated in the lists of those who are prisoners of war. As you probably know, there are a lot of victims in Kyiv region, and we do hope that Metro is alive and well. Speaking of journalist safety and security, this is the first time we face such colossal challenge. Even during Maidan, the situation was more under control, especially in Kyiv. Unfortunately now, the journalists are being hunted, public activists are being hunted. FSB has lists of journalists and public activists that they want to abduct, take hostage, destroy. They want to convince Kremlin propaganda that these people have to be destroyed. And there is one thing that really strikes me, and this again underscores how different we are from Russia, is that local media choose to fire 100% of their employees, but do not give them over to the Russian propaganda. We know a few cases that local media agreed to collaborate with the Russians, but hundreds of media agencies decided to close down rather than cooperate. They were threatened. There were even instances that one journalist's father, who was in his late 80s, he was taken hostage. We know that 50 journalists were kept for 6 hours, and they at the gunpoint. They were forced to choose Russian propaganda over truth. They demanded that 100% of their journalists get fired, basically lay off, but they do not want to present censored information and cooperate. Just compare what we see in Russian media. They don't have similar challenges related to safety, security, and even life, but they choose liberal media. They choose not to use the word war. They are obedient when it comes to censorship. And I believe this is their contribution to having Putin in power and having Putin's propaganda across Russia. The issue of safety and security, that's the issue Russia is fully responsible for, and they have to be taken into account in the Hague International Criminal Court. We have a task force created. We document all crimes together with the prosecutors. We collect the information that we are going to pass over to The Hague, and Russia is going to be held responsible for that. There is one more crime that should be heard in The Hague. This is propaganda. We are all talking about Rwanda example, the radio of 1,000 hills, but Russian propaganda, Kremlin propaganda is thousands times worse. That's the crime which is incomparable. We cannot even find example to compare it against Russian propaganda. Russia has to be responsible for what they are doing. And I do want international community to understand And they shouldn't be talking about the right to lie, that propaganda is a variety of presenting information. It's a severe crime. And Russia has to be held accountable for this crime. And I do hope that international community will unite their efforts in order to document this crime, and which later will be tried in the Hague International Criminal Court. And in summation, I'd like to say that I'm proud of my colleagues, Ukrainian journalists, who are working in the front line, who are working in all major cities of Ukraine, who are documenting all the crimes. All my colleagues with who I work, they all remember that we are at war, in active hostilities phase, and there has to be the balance between the freedom of expression and safety and security. We have fantastic balance and fantastic understanding of safety and freedom of expression. I believe that we are showing a good example to other journalists, other countries. My thoughts resonate with Portnykov's thoughts about the 3 channels that were ousted from digital broadcast. I believe that they were in the wrong taking this decision. We should not do anything that Putin's Russia is doing. Democracy is our top value. We have democracy owing to activities of our journalists, activists, our media. Yes, we sometimes disagree, sometimes we argue, but this is how we differ from Russia. Once dictatorship comes to our cities, it destroys our journalism. Putin's forces, troops already targeted 11 towers. But we are different from Putin's Russia, and this is where we are the strongest. Thank you very much. Thank you, Oksana. Now I'd like to give floor over to Halyna Petrenko. Today there was the statement made by the Ministry of Defense and the media movement of journalists, where we agreed on certain rules of disclosing information and presenting information about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I agree with Oksana that this probably wouldn't have been possible in Russia, because this was done without any pressure. Ministry of Defense did not exert any pressure. No other agencies exerted pressure. That was our mutual consensual agreement. We were also talking about mistakes made by our leadership, by our government. Do you have an understanding what has to be done so that we continue paving the path, listening to each other, listening to the civil society, listening to the government, and remembering about our safety and security, but making sure that freedom of expression stays as important as it is. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. The freedom of expression during the war, for me personally, means that, yeah, I agree that freedom of expression, given the circumstances we are living in now, the full-scale invasion, so we do have freedom of expression, and sometimes government interferes into the work of media, but our freedom of expression is fantastic if we compare to what's happening in Russia. But the main issue is that our system of protection of freedom of expression should be flexible, relevant to the situation in the country. Once we win this war, we should be capable of working outside those restrictions that were imposed on us today. It happened so that in December 2021, in Detector Media, we did a sociological survey. We talked to ordinary people about media problems. And one of the questions we asked was, what's more important, the freedom of expression or the protection of the government against disinformation? So that was late December 2021. 41% of our respondents said that freedom of expression is more important. 42% said that protecting the government against disinformation is more important. 17% were not sure. They were hesitant about the answer. No one did any sociological survey since then, whether this opinion changed since the active hostility stage started. I have a theory, which is not confirmed yet, but I believe that our people are more tolerant these days when it comes to regulating the disinformation protection principles, and it's understandable. Once we win this war, I'd like to see how the scales would differ. Maybe some people will lose their home, job, source of income. Maybe they will be more preoccupied with issues of how to survive. Maybe more important for them will be the access to freedom of information, freedom of expression, freedom of speech. And this is one of the possible dangers that I see once we move from active hostility stage to truce and victory. So maybe we won't be enjoying the support of our citizens when it comes to freedom of expression. Speaking of journalists, attitudes, so I do have this fear when it comes to national marathon. My attitude could be difficult and different. I'm not going to criticize it, but my concern is that all media representatives I've been working with, I've been talking to, those who are now part of this marathon, who represent private newsrooms, I know that they are not discontented. They are not unhappy that there are some rules in terms of their editorial policy. This is my concern. So once the war is over, they will remain in this mode of collaboration with the government, and they would try to please the owners of the medias they are working in. My observation is that when we criticize those news presenters who were involved in sharing Russian propaganda and disinformation, so this criticism appeared after 3 channels were ousted from digital broadcast. I believe that we suppress the journalists in some place, but also we welcome the discussion. On the other hand, it's important that our system is flexible and adaptive, and we can easily get away from the restrictions back to freedom. It's important that we preserve the variety in our media system. There is a proverb: before the fat man loses weight, the thin man will die. So today, this is day 3 when we started using advertising and commercials on TV channels. It's good news because they are the locomotive. It also helps us to decide on the principles how we should work with our audience, and it also helps raise funds for regional media. But it's been day 3 since they put on commercials back on TV, and we understand that all companies in our broadcasting, so these are pharmaceutical companies. Pharmaceutical companies haven't been part of commercials for a long time. It's important not to lose regional media, local media, journalist investigation projects, and those projects that offer good documentaries, because we are going to need it not only for communication inside the country, but also outside.
Яке ми проводили наприкінці грудня 2021 року, ми громадянам ставили запитання.
And the survey that we conducted in late December also contained a question, at least we intended to ask them about their attitude to various media. We formulated it like this. What was their attitude to regulating the bloggers' activities? And 34% of the respondents said that the government should not regulate those activities at all. And 30% had a totally opposite opinion, and they said that regulation should be imposed. Those who objected to the state regulation of the bloggers' activities, in their vast majority, 65%, said that the internet should be a free space for venting your opinions and likes and dislikes. Another part of those who objected to the state regulation of the bloggers' activities just mistrusted the government. They didn't think that this regulation could be effective. Those who were in favor of such regulations said that it should cover all people working online without any exclusions, be it on commercial basis or on voluntary basis and free of charge.
Наталя, звук вимкнений у вас.
Я хочу звернутися, вибачте, я хочу звернутися до...
Sorry, I was muted. I would like to invite now Kateryna Miasnikova. You chair one of the media associations, the National Media Association. And amongst your members, there are certain regional media outlets. Can you tell us about the situation on the ground amongst the regional broadcasters? What are the processes underway? How do they see their own role during the war? And perhaps what are their projections for the future? Can the information space of Ukraine survive in the times of the war, or will it be able to be reborn after the war, given the diversity that our colleagues characterized before? Thank you, Natalia. Dear colleagues, I think that our media space is being hardened by various tests and trials, and every time we face new challenges. When it comes to our outlets in Chernihiv Oblast, for example, the premises of the TV studio have been destroyed, and I'm not sure they will be able to utilize it in the future. And in some of the cities, the missile hit the house where a TV channel was accommodated. And a lot of our association participants or members had to flee their homes and their studios. In Berdyansk, for example, they terminated or at least suspended their work. speaking about central and western parts of Ukraine, situations differ also depending on the economic status of those oblasts. In Ivano-Frankivsk Oblast, for example, they received a lot of IDPs, including journalists who are now just getting to adjust to their new circumstances. And there are difficulties with providing people with housing and medical assistance, let alone with jobs. And whereas in February, regional radio studios had statistics comparable with those of 2019, they did start to restore their full capacity. Now we have got some of the outlets that actually had to lay out their people and terminate their activities. And as I said, a lot of our members and our partners, like the Institute of Mass Information and Internews Ukraine and other colleagues, provide whatever is possible to support those outlets in the form of micro, mini grants, etc. So if we manage to survive over the next 6 months to 12 months, then I think we will be capable to restore our network of local and regional media outlets. That would be challenging, of course, because the major asset of the regional and local media outlets was the people, their professional personnel. And if we lose those, I'm not sure we will be able to survive. And I would now echo what Ihor told us about regulation and the case of the Premier, Espresso and Fifth Channel. We have to get accustomed to 3 organizational or legal modes. And during the February, we in our association developed a number of proposals to be submitted to the Ministry of Defense on our interplay interaction under potential martial law conditions that we anticipated at that time. But what happened in reality is a combination of being afraid to call things by their names, to call a spade, even though we have got the legislation on martial law. And we should have told the people, frankly, that the all-national TV marathon is part of our military civil cooperation, that we will be inviting this list of channels to participate. We will be changing their schedules, and this will be the turn that they take their slots, etc. So that we and those channels who participate would know who has to pay for the broadcasting, who would be responsible for the difference in access to the air, and all of that should be in the law on martial law. And we wouldn't have to be distracted with such discussions today. So, and when it comes to the martial law regulation, there should be a whole section on media activities, mobilization of journalists and cameramen, for example, and their capabilities, because some of the channels and outlets had to reduce their activities just because they lacked equipment and personnel. The second mode should be provided for the period of a more acute situation when the aggressor country is present in our territory. And then we should recognize that we would have to look for ways to establish certain rules for online broadcast. What we are observing now is an explosion in the number of our audiences online. And if we have two parallel worlds, the offline one where regulations apply and the online one where they don't, then it might kill the offline media space because it won't survive this competition with the online contenders. And the third mode would be regulating the after world. And we have to provide for all three modes of regulation, and they will remain topical in the very near future. The peaceful mode being the most topical, I would say. And the last thing I would like to say and to call on all colleagues to chip in is holding professionals accountable for propaganda. Now we are deprived of this opportunity to find a simple solution. And bringing propaganda stooges to account for what they do requires certain algorithms and operational procedures. And that depends on the extent to which at the international level propaganda is differentiated from the freedom of the press, of freedom of expression. We, being a country that suffered most of the propaganda, should take the lead in formulating our position and our stance. And we should urge media lawyers and experts on communication and anti-propaganda activities to set up a separate task force. In addition to that, investigating and documenting crimes against journalists. So this second task force should draft certain proposals on how the propagandists can be brought to account. So we have to pay special attention to that as well. Thank you very much, Kateryna. I do agree with you. We do indeed need such a task force and start thinking on how to expose all of the instances of propaganda. And we have already wasted a lot of time, unfortunately. And it should be a concerted effort of this civil society on the one hand and the government on the other, because just the recording of the propaganda channels and what they broadcast is expensive and very time and effort consuming. And I hope that we will be able to form this task force very soon. And we should come up with our own proposals to the government about potential cooperation. I would like to hark back to the regional media again and give the floor to Liubov from the Donetsk Information Center. In your opinion, how can Western donors support regional media outlets? And what support do you need in the first place? Do you envision any new ways and methods for the regional media to get funding under the conditions of the war? Before the large-scale invasion, that is before the 24th of February, we polled as part of our Donbas Media Forum certain journalists about their needs.
We just wanted to know about their needs, during the escalation period and the possible relocation. It turned out that half of the newsrooms didn't have plan B for such situation, didn't have stabilization fund. They didn't have the plan for relocation, for communication assets, etc. So 60% of all those polled, so they needed our assistance in relocation. 60% of what they needed was communication assets, safety, security measures, etc. In May, we are going to do another survey in order to find out how situation changed, because the first survey was done when the situation was pretty theoretical and a lot of media did not even take it seriously. They didn't even anticipate that there might be full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine. When we, speaking of communication with donors since full-scale invasion, the donors are very flexible when it comes to their projects in Ukraine. They offer the replacement of those contests that have already been in action and operating in Ukraine. So some media already receive support. Donor organizations are pretty bureaucratic when it comes to assessing applications, and this is what we saw during coronavirus crisis, because it took months for a lot of media, including our media, to adapt using our own funds or funds that had been accumulated before. Speaking of donor organizations, in January, February, they started sending letters about risk management and about the current projects, proposals for their modification, etc. On one hand, it spread panic. On the other hand, it gave us food for thought. And some of my colleagues who represent other regional media, they started thinking about possible escalation, about having plan B, contingency plan, especially when they heard information from their donors. It's important to be adaptable during the crisis, when everything is upside down, when you have to take responsibility for yourself and your employees. You as media also are responsible to your audience. In our particular instance, we are responsible to our audience in the east of Ukraine. Our audience was in a really dire situation from the very start of this war, and even earlier when the so-called People's Republic of Donetsk and Luhansk were proclaimed. Also, we were responsible to the audience in Kherson, Odessa, Mykolaiv. Our readership and our audience were brainwashed by Russian propaganda. Of course, we couldn't leave our audience without the true content. And it was very important to have support of our partners. How situation changed and what's different now, I do agree with previous speakers. We, as Ukraine, as the country, didn't have experience before, and we were not prepared to such events. Of course, we had other crises like economic crisis, financial crisis, coronavirus crisis, but we never had war crisis. We now know that residential buildings will be rebuilt in the future, and we know that we as regional media and national media, we have to think about our future activity, and we have to make plans looking forward into the future. We have to strengthen our organizational capacity. We have to work on our resilience. We have to pay more attention to institutional development, solidarity, etc. It's also important to get support from donor organizations, because donors do understand that they cannot only support individual projects when it comes to informational support, relocation support, but they have to support the media organization development. And such organizations that were mentioned by Kateryna, like IMI, Internews Ukraine, so these organizations are being supported, they are offered micro grants, and this is very important for their operational capacity. A lot of organizations ended up in a situation when they had to either suspend temporarily their activities. I know that our colleagues in Mariupol, we don't even know what's happening there. So we haven't heard from them for a while. We don't know what happened to that channel. They will probably have to start their work from scratch, because we know that in certain regions of Ukraine, they will need a lot of support, and that would be one of our priorities. It's important to get donor support, and it should be ongoing, continuous, but membership and donation and other things are not timely right now. Our audience has other needs. Donor organizations make their contributions to humanitarian relief projects. They support people who have been temporarily displaced, people who had to flee their country. They also support the armed forces of Ukraine, but unfortunately, there is little left to support media. When we are talking about donor organizations, it's important to stay in touch with them, and it's important to come across as a resilient organization. Regardless the crisis, we are capable to be reborn from ashes. We are strong, we have the goal, and we are working towards this goal, and we continue our activity and our operations following our mission. Of course, we have our audience. Of course, we are probably the only source of information for some of our audience, and we are probably the only means of communication. I talk about this, I'm talking about the audience which is now in the besieged cities, in the occupation. And for us, cooperation with Western donors might be risky, especially for those who are in the East, in terms of their safety and security, because it can be seen as cooperation with the countries which are believed to be foreign agents in Russia. And we have to think how to mitigate such risks. Thank you. Thank you, Liubov. You mentioned Souspilnist Foundation. Now I'd like to give the floor over to Andrii Sydorenko. We know about a lot of initiatives of this foundation, some joint initiatives. So that was the creation of insurance fund for the journalists. I know that you're also offering psychological support. You're providing equipment to the journalists. What's happening in your realm, and what challenges are you facing, and how can you address these challenges in the most effective way? Thank you. I'd like to talk about one aspect which is very important, and this is what our foundation is doing. This is psychological safety and psychological resilience of journalists. Here I'd like to talk about three major aspects. First, how ready we were when the war started, what we have now and what would be the outcomes after the war. And I call journalists information armed forces. What can we do so that information armed forces win this war? When we talk about the first aspect, the level of readiness before the war actually divided our life into two phases, before and after. Before the war, we had huge turnover because of professional burnout, because of professional problems, and stress was one of the biggest issues when it comes to healthcare among media employees. 80% of journalists had trauma related to their job. For 3 years, we've been implementing the mental health program for our journalists. And last year, we found out that people said that it wasn't important, it wasn't timely. It was important, it was timely, but unfortunately, there were no programs that would support this initiative. What we have now, first of all, we have the influx of traumatic information, continuous influx. You cannot distance yourself from this traumatic information. Secondly, we are working against the clock, and sometimes we are working in challenging conditions. Some journalists, those who are working in the front line, in the area of active hostilities, they risk their life and limb, and also they experience psychological pressure. All media representatives, like all people in Ukraine, suffer from stress, and they are direct participants of the active hostilities. Unfortunately, we don't have statistics about the mental health of journalists as of now, but research has it that once you are through this traumatic experience, which might be accumulated, so it might be dangerous to your health. Unfortunately, we had ignored it before. Now we are suffering from trauma, war that is, and the percentage of those who might suffer from PTSD is 25%. Besides suffering from depression, anxiety, and other signs and symptoms, some people abuse substances. So this number is growing, unfortunately. But there is also good news. Journalists and Ukrainians in general show incredible valor, resilience. We see solidarity, unity, support, and the feeling of good, because we are fighting for our values. And these are all supporting factors. Now we are going through a very sensitive period of our life, and early intervention is very important here. We need to help each other to cope with those psychological traumas, psychological wounds, let them heal early as possible. We want our journalists to be healthy, to be firmly standing on their both feet and work for our society. What's important and what we should do and what our foundation is doing, Souspilnist Foundation. In early March, together with the Center for Mental Health, we have created Resilience Hub. So that's the platform for psychological support of Ukrainians in the times of crisis. Our major focus is three areas. The first is psychological location. So we are providing some recommendations for journalists, and not only to all Ukrainians, so that they learn about their psychological, emotional spheres, so that they know how to regenerate, how to rest, renew, how to fight, and how to look for the best solutions and assistance. Second, this is psychological support. We have launched two psychological helplines. One is working locally, the other is overseas. And now we are developing the platform for professional mental health assistance. And I believe that there will be huge demand for such assistance. And the third thing, this is support of the newsroom. We are holding regular meetings, and we invite mental health provider who is addressing the questions that people have at the moment.
Які дозволяють підтримувати редакції негайно і, власне, допомагають стояти на ногах. Але ми, знову ж таки, наполягаємо на тому, щоб наполягаємо на тому, щоб підтримка українських журналістів була таким, знаєте, не разовим підходом у спортзалу, коли в нас вже там біда і все погано, а системним таким культивуванням турботи про психічне здоров'я на рівні редакції.
And we insist that it should be not a one-time event, but it should be carried out on a systemic basis, so that every journalist would be taught to cope psychologically. And for that, we need sustained support of such programs. And speaking about our services, the psychologists and psychotherapists who work with us work pro bono. And there is huge demand for such psychological counseling, and the capacity of the psychologists to provide those services pro bono is running low. And thus, we are facing a challenge whereby there would be nobody to provide the psychological counseling. Perhaps now, when it comes to freedom and life in the context of war, then we should think in greater depth about this psychological flak vest to be carried and borne by our journalists. Without mental health, there can be no physical strength and health, and the perseverance and resilience to overcome challenges and obstacles. So mental health is one of the factors that brings our victory closer. Thanks to resilience and perseverance, we find internal energy and strength to cope with all of the hardships of the war and know how to recuperate to be the most effective possible. And to end, I would like to reiterate that psychological resilience, our overall resilience, should be built up not only during the crises, but it should be a sustained effort. It's like you go to the gym regularly, not when you suffer from a heart attack and then all at once you understand that you have to be physically fit. So this body armor, psychological body armor of journalists is extremely important to all of us. We should be able to take care of ourselves, and whenever necessary, we should have a chance and a channel to seek mental and psychological support. Thank you, Andrii. We still have about 12 minutes to go. I would like to invite you to share your reflections on what you've heard. To me, some of the ideas were fairly controversial. Kat and Ihor said that we should enhance regulation so that the online media should be regulated, including the Telegram channels. And we, amongst ourselves, hold an opinion that it's good when there's no regulation of online media outlets and we can operate freely, even under the conditions of the ongoing war. Given the balance or the say very sensitive balance that should be strengthened during the war, because the media outlets have demonstrated utmost responsibility and preparedness to strike this balance between having to say something on the one hand and having to approximate our victory in a joint effort. And when you say that we are soldiers of the information front, perhaps some people would disagree. So any ideas to share? Please raise your hands. Can I? Yes, sure. I would like to comment on some of the ideas vented by our colleagues. I think it is the ripe time for us to discuss the basics, the basic premises from which we should proceed. And as Vitaly Portnykov said, we should realize that we are in a state of confrontation with the aggressor. And while the situation is like this, there should be certain restrictions related to the act of hostilities. If it is accessible, if it is what we all agree to observe, then there should be a consensus about it. It shouldn't be selective, because if we create two different media realities, online and offline one, then it will precipitate the unhealthy competition. Like in any crisis, we see the increase in consumption of digital media products. And if we all believe that there is room for self-regulation and self-awareness, then we should give this right to self-awareness and self-regulation to the heritage media, right? We should not give more rights to the mightiest. And we should not, on the other hand, allow the online media to have more freedom. So I can't understand it, because the internet is believed to be in place to provide more freedom of expression to audiences and contributors alike. When it all started, the internet was not playing a leading role, and today it is playing this role. I don't mean to say that there should be self-regulation online, but we should take a certain side, and once having done so, we should be building the entire framework accordingly. Halyna, Petrenko, any response on your part? If I may. Sure, Igor. Just in continuation of what Kateryna has said, I want to give you an example. There is a TV channel, Dead Russians, and it is about the bodies of killed Russian soldiers. I'm an adult, and it's up to me to choose whether I want to see those images or not. But if I were a child, I don't think I would be mature enough to decide whether I want to say it or not. So the correct regulation is the one when we agree on certain ground rules and all of the players actually respect those ground rules. So, and it could be a regulation akin to the community Facebook rules. And I cooperate with them very closely, and I see that some people are migrating from in the Facebook to Telegram channels. And if we are trying to establish certain ground rules, then there would be a player who would violate those rules, who would totally disrespect them, then others might think that it can be done, and then the entire market should lean towards this position. So when we speak about regulating online media outlets, it does not mean that it should be very stringent and tough regulation, but there should be some rules, basic things that the players would agree to observe. The same pertains to bloggers. A blogger might not abide by the journalism standards because they express their own opinion, but then they should declare it. They should say that they are bloggers, and thus they would not be abiding by the standards of journalism. They should articulate their position as they being funded by a political party or by a certain donor, etc. So those ground rules should be shared by the entire market and all of the players in the market. And then technologies will be playing a secondary role, because now I'm using a smartphone phone to talk to you, and media are being consumed via different channels and posts. So the regulation is about putting those ground rules in place and about those ground rules being universal rather than selective. And indeed, it would be wrong if a part of the media market would be overburdened with certain restrictions and rules, and the other would not care about those rules altogether. So, and you know that actually, it is about posting footage of certain incidents of missiles hitting certain premises, and in 5 minutes, this footage is posted and seen by everyone. So that is not correct. That is not right. And the source that plays by the rules rather than playing with the rules will always suffer. So it is a very, very fine line, and we have to somehow learn how to tell it. And in Ukraine, such regulation is a unique phenomenon, and all of our revolutions actually were inspired by fighting for the freedom of the press and expression. When we speak about regulation, what worries me is that Parliament has started to work with less with the transparency because of the war times. And we understand that the parliamentary committee would be considering a bill that would be tabled, and it would be more difficult for the stakeholders to come up with their proposals, with their amendments, etc. So we had a very tough discussion with one of my colleagues regarding one bill pertaining to the media regulation, and he said that this issue with the bill is very acute. And I told him that the parliament is so obedient right now. that you will be able to get this message across to the representatives of the government and parliamentary committee, and you will be able to push this bill through. He says, yeah, it might be easy, but since the operation of parliament is not as transparent as it used to be, then perhaps we should let sleeping dogs lie. And I think that some of the officials and MPs would rather return to that previous bill on media that we used to criticize very energetically. Dear colleagues, I would like to thank all of you for this most interesting discussion, for sharing your ideas. There is a lot of room for food for thought, I think, and we've already started to draft the action plan, and we are thinking of setting up this new task force. Therefore, I think that after this discussion, we will have to meet again and step up our efforts to articulate those ideas, to bring them together so that our victory comes sooner. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. And we would like to thank